Dick Calloway. I'm president of the Tryon Museum. And I think it's particularly appropriate that we're meeting at Holy Cross for this presentation. Miss Vance and Miss Yale were workers at All Souls Episcopal Church in Asheville, the church that is today the cathedral, but this was far, far in advance of that. They went to work there in, I believe, 1901, teaching the Bible and teaching woodworking, wood carving, and Miss Vance and Miss Yale was the weaver, Miss Vance was the carver. The second thing is that Miss Vance, I'm told, and I don't want to steal your thunder, Bruce, it'd be presumptuous if I tried, but I'm told that Miss Vance personally carved the altar that's in the chapel here, which you're welcome to see after the service, and I hope all of you will. And there's some other carving there from Tryon Toymakers too. The third thing, which Francis McCain confirmed just a few minutes ago, I'd already talked to Ambrose Mills about it today, and he said he thought he remembered it, but Francis confirmed that Miss Vance and Miss Yale did indeed attend Holy Cross in the, oh my gosh, they were in Tryon for nearly 40 years.
They were confirmed at Holy Cross.
Confirmed at Holy Cross, okay. So I had a hunch they had been parishioners here, but Francis has confirmed that for sure. So their work, their one-time presence here, and the fact that they had been workers in the church in Tryon and Asheville some years before they came here, all fits this together. We couldn't be in a better place. We're delighted to see everyone. It looked almost like Sunday morning when I drove in here, and Sunday morning's pretty crowded in that parking lot. So, I'll turn it over to Bruce Johnson in a minute. Bruce is a resident, longtime resident of Asheville. He's lived there for about 40 years. He's a writer, a historian. He made a Tales of Tryon talk in, I believe, 2019 on his book about Scott Fitzgerald and Thomas Wolfe and Zelda Fitzgerald. And we're glad to have him back now. His background was as a high school English teacher, and he has flourished as a writer and historian. He's a very good one. We are pleased and privileged to have him here. Bruce?
Thank you, Dick. I'm going to add a postscript to what Dick was talking about there. First of all, how's the sound coming through? Can you hear me all right? Good? All right, good. As Dick mentioned, I started out as a high school English teacher, so I put on my teacher's voice whenever I'm doing these. Vance and Yale actually arrived in Asheville as Presbyterians. And this is going to come out a little bit later in my story, but I had to add this to Dick's point there. And they were hired to work as parish teachers in the Episcopalian church. And the rector decided he was going to leave for 3 months, and he went to them and said, I need for you to take over and run things while I'm gone. And they said, but Reverend Swope, we're Presbyterians. And Reverend Swope said, I found over the years that Presbyterians sometimes make the best Episcopalians. I come from a very small town, so small that in Illinois that, as Garrison Keeler said, you didn't need to use your turn signals because everybody knew where you were going. So while you were in here enjoying the refreshments, I was out walking around, and I will tell you there's no easier way to get noticed in a small town than to walk around with a sport coat, talking to yourself out loud, rehearsing your lines. Pretty soon everybody was looking out the window at me. A couple dogs, one cat. Cat didn't care. He was in charge of things. But it is a wonderful town. You're very fortunate. I don't like using the word lucky. You're very fortunate to live here. And I live outside of Asheville in a little small horse farm, and 3 horses that get annoyed every time I want to ride them, so that they like their time in the pasture. I want to give a special thanks to Joy and all the volunteers who came early today and got everything set up. It was so nice from my point of view not to have to worry about that sort of thing. Joy heard me give this talk at the Lanier Library last month, and afterwards I think she went back and said to her volunteers, well, if we're going to get anybody to show up for this guy, we better bring food. So, obviously it worked. Now, she would have brought wine, we would have had twice the crowd. But, oh, seriously. Yeah.
That's why it's here so big.
And where was I? Messing with the AV. I could have been following in the footsteps of F. Scott Fitzgerald. So, as as I told I had lunch in town today, and as I told the waitress who was taking care of me, there's an old adage, I've had my best ideas after 2 drinks and my worst after 3. So, I'd known there was drinks over there, we might have entirely different talk. Rest assured, no one is more aware than I am of the approaching dinner hour. So I'm going to share with you one of the tips that I gave the speakers. For 35 years, I founded and ran the National Arts and Crafts Conference at the Grove Park Inn. And over those 35 years, I hired more than 225 different speakers. And I gave them all the same admonition. If you can't get your message across in 50 minutes, you didn't work hard enough. So rest assured, I'm not going to give you a 2-hour talk tonight, this afternoon. Michael McHugh is in the audience tonight.
He couldn't be here.
Good, yeah. Michael, special thanks to Michael McHugh. He and others, several years ago, Michael wrote the first book on Tryon Toymakers, and when I approached him about doing this book, he wholeheartedly gave me his files, his help, his advice, his editing. He was a great help to me doing this book, so a special thanks to Mike. He's written several books on Tryon artists and artisans who came to Tryon. They're for sale at the museum, and I highly recommend that you take a look at those. He's a wonderful writer, and I'd be saying that even if he was sitting here. So, with that, it has often been said that you can choose your friends, but you can't choose your relatives. A few years ago, however, I chose 2 of mine. My now adopted aunts. I think we're on our first slide up. There we go. My Vanna here is turning the pages for me. Thank you, Debbie. Otherwise, I'd be up here fumbling with it. A few years ago, however, I chose 2 of mine. My now adopted aunts, Eleanor and Charlotte. I never met either one of them, as they both passed away while I was still in grade school. But for the past 10 years, I've been tracing the journey of their lives, from Cincinnati to Chicago to St. Petersburg to Asheville, and finally to Tryon, where I found their gravestone. The weeds behind it were nearly as high as their modest granite headstone, devoid of any personal inscription, but adorned with a carving they had personally designed around 2 eternal dogwood blossoms. The granite face was nearly black, stained with mold, mildew, and tannin leaching from the wet leaves of a shadowing oak tree. Unsure whom to ask, I came back the next morning at dawn, fearful of being stopped by the local police, armed with rags, scrub brushes, bleach, and jugs of water. I was determined to rescue their names and dates for all to see, wondering, though, if anyone would care to look. But their goal was not simply to turn out hundreds of woodworkers and weavers, but instead to mold young men and women into good citizens, Christian adults with strong moral fiber, prepared to benefit their community and their families. So why was it then that these 2 women, who from 1901 until 1943 had taught hundreds of young men and women to follow the tenets of the arts and crafts movement, had nearly been forgotten? They'd been denied little more than an occasional footnote or small mention in any arts and crafts history. Well, I was as much to blame as anyone. For many years, any discussion about the arts and crafts movement focused on these 2 men. In 1901, Gustav Stickley had launched a line of simple, handcrafted furniture, which stood in stark contrast to the elaborate Victorian furniture filling most homes. Author and publisher Elbert Hubbard did the same from the Roycroft campus he founded in East Aurora, New York, soon adding hammered metalware to his arts and crafts line. I moved to North Carolina in 1985, and I too soon began writing books, articles, columns about Gustav Stickley and Elbert Hubbard, adding the history of the Grove Park Inn to my list of projects. Along the way, I kept encountering the names of these 2 modest women, but it took me another 10 years before I really began to appreciate the work and the influence of Eleanor Vance and Charlotte Yale. Eleanor Vance was born near Cincinnati in 1869. Her father, shown here in the dark suit, was a Civil War veteran and popular insurance salesman before his unexpected death at age 55, when Eleanor was a young woman. Rather than attend college, she enrolled in the Cincinnati Art Academy, where for nearly 10 years she trained as a woodcarver under two noted Englishmen, Benjamin Pittman and William Fry. Both Pittman and Fry were rooted in the Gothic style, a precursor to the arts and crafts movement, and taught the principles espoused by John Ruskin, a return to hand craftsmanship and a reliance on nature for inspiration. Now, while many of their students admittedly were members of the idle rich of Cincinnati, Eleanor Vance knew that upon the death of her father, she would have to earn her living with her hands. She absorbed all that the Pittman and Fry had to offer her, rising to become one of the finest woodcarvers of either gender ever to train at the Art Academy. She adopted the popular Gothic style and mastered the techniques required to cut, shape, and carve the intricate designs, as evidenced by this Gothic bench attributed to her. Yet, throughout her entire life, she never signed nor attempted to sell a single piece of her own artistic work. At the age of 30, she enrolled in the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, where she and her lifelong partner, Charlotte Yale, a recent music major at Oberlin College, prepared for lives as Christian missionaries in foreign lands. But before they could leave, a bout of malaria sent the two women to Asheville in 1901, seeking a moderate climate and an opportunity to put their training to good use. Modeled after an English village, Biltmore Village contained a railway station, shops, and rental houses intended to provide George Vanderbilt with a stream of income. They leased a house on one of the tree-lined streets, but they did not remain unnoticed for long. Here they met the rector of All Souls Church, who, recognizing the talents of these two energetic women, put them on George Vanderbilt's payroll as parish teachers. A group of young boys were fascinated by Eleanor's ability to transform a plain block of wood into an intricately carved bookend or tray. So the two women began combining regular Bible study classes with basic wood carving instruction. They soon became close friends with Edith Vanderbilt, who has never received the credit she deserves for improving the lives of the hundreds of families who lived on or near her husband's 125,000-acre estate. In just one small example, Edith Vanderbilt hosted a vegetable growing contest, knowing that the families would all benefit from the vegetables that they were growing to try to win the main prize. Encouraged by Edith and sponsored by George Vanderbilt, Eleanor and Charlotte organized an arts and crafts business they named Biltmore Industries. In some of Vanderbilt's vacant buildings in Biltmore Village, they began training young men and women how to cut and carefully carve walnut bookends, book racks, serving trays, and bowls. As they progressed from young carvers to skilled woodworkers, Eleanor taught the more talented workers how to make furniture, which was sold to local residents and tourists in their Biltmore Village showroom, which was managed by Charlotte Yale. Following the example set by Gustav Stickley and Elbert Hubbard, the woodworkers branded each completed piece with a shop mark suggested by Edith Vanderbilt, the word forward inside a furled banner, often beside the words Biltmore NC. Each of their pieces was designed by Eleanor Vance, who first taught the new woodworkers how to carve a simple set of initials on a bookend. As they progressed, she showed them how to trace her detailed drawings, such as the dogwood blossom, onto the walnut blanks. As interest in their woodworking items spread, Eleanor continued to churn out new designs. She practiced and taught the arts and crafts motto penned by William Morris: "Have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful and believe to be beautiful." And in the arts and crafts tradition, try that. She continued to draw her inspiration not from classic styles, but from nature. She sketched this acorn and oak leaf design in 1900 and brought it with her to Biltmore Village, and in 1915 to Tryon, where she and her carvers carved it onto the sides of their nut bowls. Each bowl required several hours of work, as it was first turned on a lathe before being set on a workbench vise and carefully carved by one of the young men or women. And for an extra charge, I love this piece, you could purchase a bowl adorned with 2 acorn-munching squirrels. Vance and Yale thought so much of this design that in 1935, they presented one to their friend, Eleanor Roosevelt, carved by Tryon's own Pauline Miller Cowan. I wonder today where it's at. The Vanderbilt's role in the development of Biltmore Estate Industries cannot be underappreciated. George Vanderbilt not only paid the salaries of Vance and Yale, but covered any annual shortcomings to ensure that the woodworkers were paid fairly for their work. Edith Vanderbilt sent a steady stream of friends to the Biltmore Village showroom, where area residents and tourists found a wide array of arts and crafts items decorated with carved dogwood blossoms, oak leaves, acorns, galax leaves, grapes, and grapevines. Always looking for additional opportunities to improve the lives of those rural families living on the estate, Edith and George Vanderbilt sent Vance and Yale on 2 trips to Scotland to learn ways to improve the weaving of homespun cloth. Many older women she had met still knew how to use these looms in their cabins. Upon their return, Charlotte and Eleanor traveled across the estate, training women to prepare the wool, spin the threads, and weave homespun cloth suitable for men and women's clothing. Charlotte trained young people in their showroom how to demonstrate the making of homespun cloth for the curious tourists, who often left with bolts of soft fabric to take back to their tailor. As her band of young men and women became more skilled, their homespun cloth and carved items were being sought across the entire country. Vance and Yale shipped a model loom from Scotland back to Biltmore Village, where their young woodworkers made additional looms. This working example was saved and is now in the Biltmore Industries Museum beside the Grove Park Inn. But in March of 1914, everything changed. Their financial patron, George Vanderbilt, died unexpectedly at age 52 after a seemingly successful removal of his appendix. He probably died from a blood clot. As soon became apparent, George Vanderbilt had not become the successful businessman like his father and brothers. He'd invested nearly all of his inheritance into land and homes. In short, he was land rich and cash poor. Eleanor and Charlotte realized that Edith, who was now also raising a 14-year-old daughter by herself, would soon have to begin reducing her financial responsibilities, including Biltmore Estate Industries. What they also realized is that their wood carvers and weavers had developed into responsible young adults who no longer relied on Vance and Yale as teachers. George Arthur supervised the workshop. Julia Brookshire ran the sales room. Others by then handled the weaving of homespun cloth, the bookkeeping, and the shipping of mail orders. In 1915, Vance and Yale decided to move to Tryon. But just in their 40s, and still caring for Eleanor's mother, they were not in a position to retire. Tryon was far enough from Asheville not to compete with the young men and women they had trained, but it was still in the mountains they had come to love. It also had a reputation as a liberal arts community, whose part-time residents and vacationers included actor William Gillette, author Margaret Morley, social activist Jane Addams, and arts and crafts jewelry designer Madeline Yale Wynn and her partner Annie Putnam. They became good friends with the new owner of Biltmore Industries, Fred Seeley, who was the president of the Grove Park Inn, which remained owned, however, by his often cranky father-in-law, Edwin Wiley Grove. Seeley, after buying Biltmore Estate Industries from Edith Vanderbilt, built 5 workshops on the hotel grounds for his woodworkers and weavers. Vance and Yale purchased a deserted bungalow at the corner of Markham and Grady Streets, which they restored and remodeled. It served as both their home and their new business, which eventually became known as Tryon Toymakers and Wood Carvers. And yes, the house is still there. Drove by it again this afternoon. Eleanor assembled a basic workshop in the basement, while Charlotte cleaned out the attic where the toys were to be painted. Their living room became the showroom. And in short, these 3 women, Eleanor, Charlotte, and their mother, Ella, lived in the rest of the house, consisting of a couple of bedrooms and the kitchen. Had to be tight quarters. Their toys were well received, enabling them to buy a similar bungalow next door. 2 substantial gifts in 1925 and again in 1932 enabled them to buy 3 acres of land on which they built the toy house in 1925 as their showroom, and a few years later, the chalet as their home. And again, all 3 buildings still exist. Kudos to Tryon. They gradually hired more young people. Eleanor supervised the painting in the second bungalow. They hired an experienced woodworker to work in the basement cutting out toys. Charlotte ran the showroom and did the bookwork. Eleanor proved even more prolific as a designer of toys as she had for 15 years as a woodcarver. Her sources of inspiration included nursery rhymes, folk tales, and Bible stories. She and her young workers were also quite inventive, as in this case, the pigs were mounted on thin wires so they would bounce as the toy was pulled across the room. One of their most famous sets was the Noah's Ark set, an example of which is in the Tryon History Museum. The number of characters increased as suggestions were made by their young workers. On the wall, you can see the patterns they followed while painting the figures. But each worker was encouraged to be creative when it came to facial expressions. Another famous toy Eleanor designed was the Mountain Home set, an example of which is in the Lanier Library display case. The lid opened to allow the children to store the figures inside the cabin when not being played with. The woman in a shoe also opened to provide a storage space for the figures, something I'm sure their parents appreciated. Their shop mark, usually a paper label or a brand, was often placed on the inside. This circus set is extremely rare. The only example I'm aware of is preserved in the North Carolina Museum of History in Raleigh. Eleanor also trained her more skilled toy makers to become wood carvers, even though Fred Seeley back in Asheville technically owned Vance's designs, which he bought from Edith Vanderbilt. But he gave them permission to begin duplicating many of her original designs, including this Gothic bench. It reveals elements of both the Gothic style in the legs and the arts and crafts style in the key tenons. The finest carver Eleanor Vance ever trained was, in my opinion, Pauline Miller, who later became Pauline Miller Cowan. Pauline went to school, got a teacher's degree, taught school for 1 year, and then showed up on their doorstep wanting to learn how to carve. They recognized soon her abilities and trained her as both a wood carver and woodworker. She carved doors for a mansion in Washington, D.C., and some of the finest carvings you're going to find in Tryon were made by her or Frank Arthur, who Vance trained before he went into business for himself. And you may be aware that Frank Arthur's home is across the street, 21 Melrose. Are the owners in the room? Yeah. I went and looked in the windows, but I don't know, I can tell you, you should. There's carvings on the outside of it that Frank did. These two massive armchairs were carved by Pauline Miller, later Pauline Cowan, for a commission for the Detroit YWCA. Now, I've been trying to track them down. We hope they're in storage in one of the Detroit museums, but I'm now sending letters out trying to find out, because if they are, they probably have no idea what these two massive chairs are. They look like they came from a Masonic lodge. But when I look at them, I hope they were too big for anybody to ever throw away. We'll keep our fingers crossed. Now, Michael McHugh helped me to dispel the myth that the horse was called Morris from the very beginning. That happened years later. The original horse, which Eleanor designed, was known for years as the Tryon horse. It was designed by Eleanor and made by Meredith Langford and Odell Peeler. And just to show her creative bent, when the rider pulled the reins, and they would use this horse to, during the parade, I should mention that they got the horse out once a year for the parade before the horse show. And the creative Eleanor fixed it so that when the rider pulled on the reins, the head lowered and the tail went up in the air. Unfortunately, this original one was destroyed in the 1939 fire, but later replacements were made as they continue to be made today and are now known as Morris. In 1936, the Farmers Federation purchased Tryon Toymakers from Vance and Yale. They served as advisors, but they gave all the patterns, papers, designs, etc. to the Farmers Federation. They in turn then started the Tryon Craft School, and that was to train grade school students to eventually work for the Tryon Toymakers at the Farmers Federation. But the 1939 warehouse fire destroyed all of the Toymaker patterns, records, documents, drawings, and signaled the end of the Farmers Federation involvement. It had to be quite discouraging for Eleanor as they watched the fire, knowing that all of her drawings, except for a few that Pauline Miller Cowan had saved in her personal papers, which are now at UNCA, but to watch her life's work go up in flames had to be devastating. The two women retired in 1943. They both died while in their 80s, Eleanor in 1954 and Charlotte in 1958, but without any children or even any nearby relatives. Their funerals were modest affairs, attended mostly by former students. For these two modest and unassuming women never viewed themselves as employers, but always as teachers. In 1955, their friend, Wilma Dykeman, wrote a book called The French Broad, and she'd gotten to know both Eleanor and Charlotte before Charlotte's death in 1954, and of course, Eleanor's in 54 and Charlotte's in 58. And in the story, in The French Broad, she writes about these two women. And she says, and I quote, "These two had gone into people's homes and given them the dignity of work, the pleasure of creation, given them respect that nourished self-respect, and opened doors of self-expression and a new livelihood." The tribute, which I wrote to them, was 10 years in the making, primarily because I knew, like with most books, if you figured up all the time and travel you do, that you knew ahead of time, you'd probably never write a book. So there were times when I had to apologize to Eleanor and Charlotte and tell them that I had to put the work on their book aside while I worked on other things. But in the last couple of years, it gave me the opportunity to go at it full force and to wrap things up. And as I was telling somebody here a few minutes ago, one of the sort of the good news and bad news about publishing a book is the good news, you can finally get it done. The bad news is that then people come up and tell you things you wish you had already known, so you couldn't put into the book. But you can't wait forever, because sometimes you never find out those real interesting bits and pieces of history until after it comes out and somebody reads it. And hopefully in this case it will be additional information rather than being corrected for something I made a mistake on. But that may be the case. At this time, I'd like to take any questions you have about this. Sometimes the Q&As are more interesting than my remarks here. And of course, those of you who need to leave, please get up and go. Don't worry about it. I won't be offended. I was a high school English teacher for 5 years. You can't offend me. So if you need to go, need to be on your way, please do. But if you have questions, shout them out. I'll answer them, and you can slip off whenever you need. In the back.
Where are the ladies buried?
Where are the ladies buried? In the old town cemetery. If you go up Markham and then take a right, or you can go up Cleveland, and what's the street that goes up to the cemetery?
Markham.
And Markham goes all the way up, yeah. And when you get to the front of the cemetery, I think you can only go to the right. You go to the right, and if you remember seeing their headstone here, it's literally, you can almost touch it from your car. Easy to find. One of the things that just amazed me about it when I went back up there this afternoon, if you go back up, take some fresh flowers. Mine are wilted. You gotta take plastic ones, the real ones blow away. What I didn't think about until I got there today was that the plot that they bought is big enough to put 9 people in. But just the 2 of them are buried in it. And it's got a very nice, and it had to be expensive, stone wall around it. Very nice, but I'm just wondering what they were thinking they were going to do with 7 other plots in the cemetery. So, things that get buried, they say secrets that go to the grave. Well, that's one of them right there. So, yes, question?
My brother-in-law was Tom Moore. I don't know if you've heard that name or not.
Recognize it?
He was married to my sister Mary Moore. And Mary is attributed to having come up with the name Morris on a winter's night on Wilderness Road, sampling local wine.
I heard that story.
But more importantly, Tom supposedly took lessons from Mrs. Vance. And when you go upstairs, the angel flying above was carved by Tom.
Go upstairs where?
In the church.
In the church.
Oh, here. I thought you meant someplace else. Okay.
This
Huge angel.
Okay. Yeah.
He would travel around the county. He did a lot of building.
Yeah.
And he would look for particular trees that had fallen over. And he would look at the roots and say, that has possibilities.
Yeah.
And the roots of that tree came from the county, and he took it and eventually made it into what you see hanging above the...
Wonderful.
So,
One of the frustrating things being a historian is that when Eleanor Vance was training as a wood carver, there was, even though in the arts and crafts era, well, this is true of Albert Hubbard and Gustav Sickley, the company would have their shop mark, but individuals were not allowed to put their extra initials in or their extra mark. And in part that is because more than one person was involved in it. There might be a young man who was in the basement turning the blank out for the bowl, then the bowl went upstairs to somebody else who did the carving, and then it may have gone to somebody else who put the final finish on it. And so one of the sort of frustrating things as a historian is that anytime you pick up any of these pieces over here and look at them, you may very well find the Tryon Toymakers mark or the Biltmore Industries mark, but you won't find somebody's, somebody's initials that you can identify. So rarely. Occasionally somebody sneaks them in. And that may be a case too where in all these shops, many times an individual would be allowed to make something knowing that they were taking it home at Christmas for a gift. And in a case like that, then, because occasionally we will find a couple of initials on the bottom, but as a general rule, the only signature was the Tryon Toymakers or the Biltmore Industries mark branded in.
It should also be noted that Tom was known, he was one of the founders of Vance here in Tryon.
Yeah.
And he was known to have carved or created the head of Morris, which he would place on the front of his truck. And he would put a covered wagon over the back, because at that time, as many people as you could squeeze into your vehicle got in free.
Got in free, for one price. Yeah.
He was known to have driven to Greenville Airport to pick up somebody with Morris.
Great story.
So he got a lot of mileage out of Morris.
I'm sure. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
When I moved here about 46 years ago, there was a barber shop, and John Lewis Thompson owned it. He was an older man, and he did wood carving. And one day when I walked in, he had a mantle sitting there, and I said, "John Lewis, why is this mantle here?" He said, "Well, I was going to sell it to this man, but it's not going to work." I said, "Well, I really love this," and he said, "Well, I carved it for my mom. He was a wood carver and had, I don't know if you know this, but
No.
he had all these Biltmore House carvings. I don't know everything, but I said, well, I'd like to buy it." So it was in the basement, so I did it for my mama. But when my mama died, I didn't want my sisters to get it. I put it down in the basement, and so I did buy it, and I've got it in my house. And
Wonderful.
supposedly, it's gratefully, it's supposedly one of the Biltmore House patterns.
Now, what you need to do is write that story down and put it on the back of the mantle. You know, we should do that with all the pieces that you have, family stories, photographs. It's so frustrating as a historian or a second or third generation to pick up a wonderful photograph and not know who the people are in it, or in that case, a piece of furniture that you know who made it, but I mean, eventually somebody else is going to be looking at that trying to decide whether it goes in the yard sale or
And
not.
I would go to house, knew him or knows it, and he told me, he said, "I've got all these pieces of furniture that I carved."
Yeah.
And when I moved here, he carved everybody's name in a little sign and put their, it was all
Yeah.
hand done.
And you probably train, very easily. And Frank Arthur, who not broke off, that's a terrible word to say. Eleanor trained Frank Arthur, as she did George Arthur, who remained in Asheville, but Frank Arthur, and then Frank worked for them for several years before he started his own business. And Frank Arthur also gave wood carving lessons. So I think a lot of people, more than your average small town, had sort of self-taught, locally trained wood carvers. Yes, in the back.
I know it's rude to ask, but how much did the lady pay for the mantle?
$125.
Just put a zero on it today. Yeah. And one of the things I did not attempt to do in my book, because it just seemed beyond the scope of it, and sometimes you just have to draw a line and say, is to try to track down every piece, every mantle that was carved for different churches and homes around town and stuff. And so there's a whole other subject that you could follow up on something like that. But wonderful. Yes?
I've got a question. This is my second go-around with your talk. And
Did I get any better?
I enjoyed it both times.
Thank you.
You talked about the Carvers, but you never talked about why Charlotte Vance was your aunt. What was her contribution to the business?
Charlotte was the quiet one. Charlotte was a mystery. Charlotte went through but Charlotte was the PR person. She did the bookkeeping, she ran the shop. But boy, if you got to go, you just get up and leave, folks, because you get me going on these questions. And Charlotte was born in Cheyenne, Wyoming in 1870. It was a cow town. It was gunfights in the street and that sort of thing. She went through and then And she was the one that did the interviews with newspaper reporters. Never once mentioned that she grew up in Cheyenne, Wyoming, or how at age 18 she got on a train in Cheyenne, Wyoming and went 1,200 miles to Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio, and was a music major, and then dropped out one semester before graduation. Never mentions it, like it didn't happen. She went through life telling people that she was an orphan. Well, her father died when she was very young. Her mother didn't die until 1910. Her mother died in St. Augustine. And Charlotte went down and spent some time with her before she died. Charlotte loaded her mother's body onto a train, brought her to Asheville, she and Eleanor lived in Asheville, Biltmore Village in 1910 when Charlotte's mother died. Bought a cemetery plot for her in Riverside Cemetery and bought a very nice stone for her mom, buried her there, never spoke of her again. So I don't know what went on there, but I go to the cemetery and I talk to her and she doesn't talk back. She took some secrets to the grave with her. But she was, and they did weaving for a short time here in Tryon, but it didn't go so well. But like I said, I think Charlotte's role was really to take care of the business part of it, while Eleanor was the artistic one.
And if people associated her with Yale College, she just let that go too.
Oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
There was a major assumption there that with the last name Yale, sometimes she just wouldn't deny things. And so a lot of people thought that, well, last name Yale, and they also thought that Eleanor, last name Vance, maybe she's related to Zebulon Vance, maybe they got money trickling down. No to both of them. No relationship to the Yale Lock Company, and no relationship to Governor Vance. The two ladies were on their own their entire life. And I mentioned in passing, but now you give me a chance to talk more about it, I mentioned that Eleanor's father died when he was in his 50s, 55, and Eleanor was like 19 or 20 years old. Ella, her mother, traveled with her the rest of her life. So when Eleanor decided to go to the Moody Bible College because she couldn't get a job as a wood carver in Cincinnati, even though she was probably the best in the city. Those male-dominated architects and builders were not going to hire her. So she decided at age 30 to become a missionary and moves to Chicago, what Ella comes along with. And then they announced to Ella, they being Charlotte and Eleanor, that they're going to go to India to be missionaries. And suddenly Ella has a fainting spell. And the doctor says, you got to get out of Chicago, go to Florida. So the three of them went to Florida, and where then Eleanor got malaria, and their doctor said, yeah, go to Asheville. They got a bunch of doctors up there, clean mountain air. And so the three of them moved to Asheville, and so Ella was with them. Ella was one of these women that was always on her deathbed and lived for friggin' forever. It was the 1920s before she finally died. And then in her obituary in Tryon, it mentions in passing she was deaf her whole life. Whoa, where'd that come from? So, yeah, that just raises Eleanor and Charlotte to sainthood. It just really does. And yes?
Yeah, what became of the chalet that they lived in?
The chalet is still up there. It's a rental house. Beautiful. In 1932, like I said, there was some money in Tryon, even during the Depression. There was some family money. The Putnam Publishing, money, people came to Asheville to Tryon to winter, to get away from whatever was going on up there. And I don't know, in the 20s, how many people lived here? 800? They all knew each other. I like to think they partied hard together, I hope. And so they all knew each other. And so I think some of these wealthy heiresses donated money to Charlotte and Eleanor because they recognized what they were doing, and they're teaching these young people, and they're not keeping any money for themselves. They're just getting by. And so, like I say, in 1925, they got money to build the toy house. And they bought that 3 acres, about 3 acres of land there. And if you kind of, when you drive up Markham, especially when the leaves fall off, you can get a better idea. But there's about 3 acres of land from the toy house to the corner, and then go up Grady Street. And the first driveway on the left goes up to the chalet. So in 1932, they got another bequeathment. They got more money in 32. And the Depression was going on. And they were down to about 5 or 6 young workers. And so what they did was, instead of taking that money and retiring somewhere, they stayed and they built the chalet. One of their former students was a contractor. He built the shell of the house. And then each day, those young men and women came to the chalet and worked on it. And they paid them out of that money they'd been given. And then they moved into the chalet. And then the toy house was their showroom. And the bungalow on Markham was their workshop. And then eventually what got them through in quote-unquote old age, women, I mean, you lived a long time, was rent from the properties. At different times they moved into the toy house and rented out the chalet and the bungalows, and that's what they lived on. There was no Social Security. They died, they didn't even have Social Security numbers. So they just lived off their rental income at the end and lived very frugally, very frugally. Yes?
I had interviewed Jack Jolly for an article I wrote for the Tryon Daily Bulletin, and he and his brother Wilbur were the ones who built the second Tryon horse when the first one burned. And I got a phone call from Jack Jolly about 6 months ago, so he's still alive. Does anybody here in the audience have that contact information for Jack Jolly or know any of his family members?
I do.
You do? Because I'd love to give it to Bruce. So
Yeah.
we can talk to him. All right, I'll see you.
Make the note.
Okay. Thank you.
Question, yeah.
Bruce, I might have missed it, but how did the two ladies come together? Did they meet and...
That's another one of the mysteries that they left undetermined. They gave different stories. I don't know whether, one story was that they met at the Moody Bible College in Chicago, which was basically where you went for like a 3-month training session to become missionaries, either, you know, in the United States or abroad. One story is they met there. Another story was that they met in Cincinnati, and here's Oberlin and here's Cincinnati. That's possible. They're both still in the state of Ohio, but they were never very clear about exactly where and when they met. Other questions? I couldn't have answered everything in that slideshow. Yes?
In the wheelchair.
Pardon? Oh, Nell Light. L-I-P-E, Nell. She was a fireball. Nell Light was, she was in a wheelchair and crutches ever since she was a child, born with, I don't know whether she got polio early on or had some infantile paralysis. But she was one of their best carvers, and so she trained there. And then, in 1917, I kind of skipped over this, when Edith Vanderbilt had to start selling things. She sold Biltmore Industries to Fred Seeley. Now, when I give this talk in Asheville, the second half of the talk is different than what you saw here tonight, because Asheville people want to hear about Biltmore Industries in Asheville. They don't care so much about Tryon and vice versa. But Fred Seeley buys Biltmore State Industries from Edith Vanderbilt. Well, Nell is in a wheelchair, so she couldn't make the trip from Biltmore Village to North Asheville, and so Fred Seeley, she was such a good carver, allowed her to work from home. And Fred Seeley, just to give you 5 minutes on Fred Seeley, son-in-law of E.W. Grove, president of the Grove Park Inn, but never owned the Grove Park Inn. And he knew that someday he was going to get kicked out of his lease, which he did. So in the meantime, he bought Biltmore State Industries so he could have his own business rather than always being in the shadow of his father-in-law, who had all the money. So Fred Seeley was a tough taskmaster. He was hard on everybody, including his 5 kids. They never spoke well of him. But through the entire Depression, banks went under, businesses closed, Biltmore Industries never missed a day. Fred Seeley kept it going. He dies in 1942, and Biltmore Industries ran for another 30 or 40 years just on the basis, just sort of writing his organization, until finally it just ran out of power, and the looms got too old and that sort of thing. But what was your question? Oh, Nell White. So Fred Seeley, as tough as he was, allowed Nell to work at home. And then every now and then I would find these notations when I was doing research for one of the Grove Park Inn books that he was paying hospital bills for Nell White. So, then there was this great story in the Citizen Times when Nell was crossing the railroad tracks at Biltmore Village and her wheelchair got caught in the tracks and the train was coming. And if you read some of the newspaper stories from back then, those writers, they really built it up. I mean, it was like, and so they were talking about the treacherous train is roaring upon this poor crippled woman caught in the tracks. And a guy ran out and scooped her up and got her out of the way, and the wheelchair got smashed to smithereens. But, and then in her later years, Nell became a real activist in the Democratic Party in county politics, and was just a real firebrand. She was quite a lady. So, yes, that was more than you wanted to know. No. It's just a wheelchair.
This is your leading question is, where can you now purchase your book?
Right back here. Yeah, the museum. The museum sells.
Everybody knew that.
Oh, that's it. Nice. That's nice. I should have mentioned that. So. Yeah.
No, they didn't, Shields. I should have mentioned it, and I was about to do so.
Yeah.
This is a wonderful book. I read it twice. I reviewed it from paper. And you're missing something if you don't read it.
And I can tell you one thing about the book, too.
Okay.
When I got to the publishing part of the book, all my friends in the publishing business said, oh, you have it printed in China or Vietnam, and you get it done at half the price. And I thought, no, I'm not going to do that, because then there are horror stories of books that never make it back and things going on. So the book was printed in the United States. It made it more expensive. But the bulk of the money, I get a couple of dollars, and it's really a fundraiser for the museum. So buy it; it makes a great gift. I'll personalize any of them for you. And but no, the museum's gone for sale.
I think it's important to mention that the textile, piece of textile.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, in each one of these there is a piece of Biltmore homespun. You make friends along the way, and up at Biltmore Industries, where I did a lot of research. They found a couple rolls of cloth put away. And they already had some on display in the museum. And so I said, it'd be real special. And so they saw, yeah, they gave me some cloth. So I cut up little bookmarks. Silly stuff people do. I cut up little bookmarks and put a piece. Because a lot of people, when you hear the word homespun, you think burlap. You think it's going to be scratchy and you can't wear it and that sort of thing. Homespun's very soft. Very soft. And Fred Seeley perfected it. Vance and Yale and Edith Vanderbilt got it going. Fred Seeley turned it into a big business and employed a lot of people. But it's a very soft material. Women loved it. One of her most famous clients was Grace Coolidge, First Lady, and she liked red, so they called it Coolidge Red. And of course, everybody had to have Coolidge Red that fall. Fred Seeley was great at marketing. You see these pictures of the Grove Park Inn, all the famous celebrities, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Harry Houdini, Eleanor Roosevelt. They kept coming back because Fred never charged them. Never charged them. Because he knew who comes with celebrities? The press. There's that famous, in my world, famous picture of Edison, Ford, Harvey Firestone, and Fred Seeley standing in front of the Grove Park Inn, August 18, 1918. That picture was on the front page of every newspaper across the country. Fred Seeley got more publicity out of that. And they loved Fred because they go to check out and beat zeros across the bottom of the building. Smart guy. And one time he saw a newspaper picture of Will Rogers. And he wrote Will Rogers a letter. And the great thing about Fred Seeley was he saved every letter he ever wrote. He did carbon copies. He said, there was a basement full of letters. Whereas Charlotte and Eleanor never wrote letters because they were always together. That was very frustrating. But he wrote a letter to, who did I just say? Will Rogers, saying, hey, I saw you in that frumpy suit. I'm going to send you 7 yards of Biltmore homespun. Get a good suit made. It worked. And it worked. Other questions? Yes?
Eleanor Vance briefly married?
Eleanor Vance was briefly married. That was the bombshell. I had no idea. And if any of you are historians or want to be historians, you get a subscription to newspapers.com. It costs you $80 a year. You can type in anybody's name and you look up dead classmates and friends and relatives. A friend of mine at Biltmore Industries sent me a clipping. 1913, September, Eleanor Vance to be married. Eleanor's 44 years old. Has lived with Charlotte her adult life. And suddenly she's marrying a man from California, John Bryant, that no one's heard of. And it's like a notice this long. And then it gets even more mysterious. The wedding, they belong to All Souls Church. These two Presbyterians, me being a Presbyterian, these two Presbyterian ladies came and became Episcopalians and worked at All Souls Church. But the announcement says she's getting married in Chattanooga, in her distant aunt's house, and that they're going to live in Louisville, Kentucky. So I gotta do my math. Without the book, I'd have to take a look at it. The fall of 1913, Ella, her mother, who's always ill and deaf, and Charlotte and Eleanor get on a train in Biltmore, and I can't imagine Edith Vanderbilt must have been scratching her head saying, "Where'd this come from?" With John Bryant from California? I mean, what sort of a courtship? Who is this guy? The three of them get on a train and go to Chattanooga, and she gets married in her aunt's living room, and then moves to Louisville in the fall of 1913, all right? Well, then I'm thinking about Charlotte. Here's Charlotte with her, I don't know what you'd call it. Ella considered Charlotte to be like a daughter, But now here's Charlotte, who's not Eleanor by any means. They're going back to Biltmore Village together to run Biltmore Industries without Eleanor. It just does not make any sense at all. And what a train ride that must have been. And then in March, you go from fall to March, 6 months later, George Vanderbilt dies, 1914. And then Charlotte and Eleanor knows what that means. That means that Biltmore Estate Industries is going down the tubes because George had been they never showed a profit because they paid their wood carvers very well. So she knew the stress that meant for Charlotte. 3 months later, she leaves John Bryant. He eventually sues her for divorce, citing desertion. And Eleanor moves back in July of 1914. And I think that had a little bit to do with the fact that they decided to move to Tryon. Had to be an awkward moment or two. And when I said that as a historian, one of my greatest challenges was the fact that there were no letters written between Eleanor and Charlotte because they spent their entire lives together except for 13 months. I'll tell you, they had a letter burning ceremony at the end of those 13 months, because they wrote letters back and forth. Nothing has shown up. So I suspect that, and it was like it never happened. And again, it was just like Charlotte with the mother that she didn't ever claim, but yet she buried. It was like no mention was ever made. And I'll wrap this up because Dick's getting a little nervous with me here.
I have to catch a plane, I'm sorry.
Oh, well, you can go anytime you want. We'll be here all night. Last thing I want to say about it, Eleanor lied on her census every 10 years, put herself checked single, never checked divorced. So it's still one of those puzzles. And go up there to the hospital, go up there to the cemetery, talk to them. Maybe they'll tell you. I have no idea what happened there. All right, thank you very much.
That was one thing. Hold a minute, please. I apologize for my restlessness, but I wanted to stay and tell you two very important things that I forgot. The first is, and I was quite remiss here, thank the Polk County Community Foundation for sponsoring these Tales events. We couldn't put on the show we do without them. We're grateful to them and looking forward to a long relationship with them. We've already had one for several years and we hope to go for many more. The other thing is, if you've enjoyed these, would like to help the museum, and no, I'm not going to ask for any money, not right now at least. I'm sorry. I can't because of the Community Foundation. But if you'd like to help the museum, volunteer. We need more docents to keep the doors open. more days a week than we're able to right now. It's very important because we're also the official Tryon Visitor Center, and we're trying to live up to that. So please think about volunteering. Talk to Joy Soderquist about that, and she will give you a job. It doesn't have to be more than 2.5 hours a shift every couple weeks or so. 1 or 2 shifts a month on the part of several of you, in addition to who we have now, would just be wonderful. So I guess that's it. Bruce's book, that's been mentioned now, but please, that is a wonderful book. You're cheating yourself if you don't buy it.
And the chapel.
And the chapel, upstairs. Follow Skip Crow. There's quite a show to continue up there.
We're gonna go, right?
Okay then.
Upstairs.
That's it. Thank you all. Thanks again.